Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, and this is your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today, we're going to dive into an international report starting with Canada, determining whether or not profits will disappoint Wall Street, followed by a potential glut. There's an outdoor harvest season that's about to happen. So we're going to take a look at other international markets such as Uruguay. We'll look at Israel, talk about Jamaica, and of course, highlight Puerto Rico. On the line with us is Dan Kimmis, our CBD correspondent with Good CBD Products.
It is a small world after all, Chronic. Hey, I'm out in the field doing fall harvest stuff right now, so I'm looking forward to this. I want to do some learning.
So first, let's talk about Canadian cannabis grower profits potentially disappointing Wall Street. This Yahoo article goes on to say that, quote, most cannabis stocks are trending at or near their 52-week lows, with the imminent earnings seasons creating anxiety in the midst of traders. So some analysts believe that slower buying by provinces has no signs of opening new retail locations and pouring cold water on the expectations of the next reporting quarter. Canada is supposed to have their 2.0 on October 17th, which is the introduction of additional solvent extracts besides just CO2 and alcohol or ethanol. They're able to have propane, butane, all the other solvents, as well as beverages and other products. So they still believe that there's going to be a deceleration in sales, even with an acceleration in licensed producers. They believe that profitability is going to disappoint due to potential sequence revenue declines and increased costs. And so they break down, Aurora Cannabis and Canopy Growth, determining their EBITDA and a going concern. And so they say that the price decreasing and consumer per federal licenses on the decline. That way the future holds a less profitable system than exists today. Rather than wild profitability in 2 years, they are forecasting a rough break-even scenario for the Canadian licensed producers. So not too great of a one-year recap.
I got some pals up north. And one of the things that's been amazing is, again, I guess we can say this without naming any names or anything, but man, they've bungled the bureaucratic side of this implementation so dramatically that, what really, again, a year ago, people were predicting Canadian cannabis going to go boom, right? Today, you're getting, modeling that would say, meh. And again, this comes back to how was it implemented? How were the rules done? What was the tax? How much red tape was there? And again, at some point in the future, a lot of this is going to be resolved. And until it is the bloodbath that it is, this is where I have so much fun learning this stuff because, again, in the end, people like us get to save people money, right? Because, again, Canada, if you thought it was going to be the answer for where to go put your bread in one of those big stocks, you got some stuff, again, there's so much happening.
There is a lot of emphasis is on Canada because they're the major global player, even though Uruguay started first. We'll get into that report later. But first, a growing supply glut. So with outdoor harvest season rapidly approaching next month, typically in November or even late October, we're having an early winter. It's raining here in Seattle more than usual. And so I would imagine that a lot of people that have Blue Dream or anything that's kind of a late bloomer, they may end up dealing with extra mold or extra issues. Not really sure, but there could be a glut. So all of that oversupply, all of those high prices could end up going up. So the glut in Oregon could be reduced. Who knows? We'll find out. But this article goes on to say that, quote, Canadian cannabis producers are harvesting enough pot to satisfy 81% of the total demand projected by Health Canada. The problem is that legal states in June amounted to just 14% of demand by volume, according to new data from industry researchers, the Cannabis.
I see it myself, again. So first, on the ground, hemp harvest and such is happening now. Cannabis harvest is starting to happen. And again, you're right. Like if you're in Washington right now, it feels like the weather's maybe 3 weeks ahead of where it should be. And that's pushing some people to make some really interesting decisions, literally daily.
So there has been a lot of emphasis on the Canadian market being, just north of the U.S. and having those international opportunities. And so with that, there's some emphasis on Uruguay being the very first country to legalize, looking at a global market for medical cannabis opening up. So the small but landmark export underscores the country's push into the burgeoning market for legal cannabis that has medical uses, including helping cancer patients, managing chronic pain, or treating spasms associated with multiple sclerosis. Their goal is to create $1 billion industry in Uruguay for the next 5 to 7 years. So the firms that are there are hoping to announce shipments to the European Union, where Germany is the key market. They have 70 million medical patients that have access to insurance. And so just like Canada, Uruguay is kind of hoping to jump into, a more medicinal market such as Germany. Kind of have to see what happens. A lot of profitability potentials, but a lot of pitfalls as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm personally interested in, the nature of international distribution, right? And what it means about the time you actually have, country A officially signed up to export to country B. And again, we're kind of there, right? It's just going to keep happening. So.
Well, the article doesn't really go into a lot of details, but I do know that George Soros is heavily involved. The guy's got a lot of money. He's politically motivated. So I have no doubt that Uruguay will play some part. I just don't really know what it is because there's a lot of competition to Colombia with their terroir and their cheap labor costs. I don't know a lot about Uruguay. They're landlocked in South America. Maybe they have political advantages. Obviously, if George Soros is involved, there's some easy mechanisms for him to navigate. But there is competition. Israel's been in the game for a really long time. And so there's a different article from Benzinga that talks about an Israeli cannabis company focusing on formulations, enhanced delivery, extraction. There's definitely a medical program that Big Tobacco has been involved with for a long time. So there's more of a clinical approach in Israel than probably anywhere else, where they definitely don't want flour. There's like these little slides that you can put into a vaporizer, similar to a projection slide. And these little like slices of flour are put in there. You can't smell it. They're disposable. So that's kind of the route that Israel is going. Is very medicinal, very clinical. It's specialized, but they're ahead of the game.
One of the things that I keep hearing is, med tech, right? Medical tech. And again, from an investment opportunity, the nature of just how much promise there is, right? And so, it would make sense that some of the different countries and governments and bureaucracies really that have a leaning toward future and being ahead of the curve, that they would be playing in that space, of course.
So there was a doctor back in the 60s that discovered the structure of CBD and the process to isolate and synthesize THC. And so you couple that with just not long ago, Israel started to allow exports of cannabis to other countries, becoming one of a handful of countries in the world to do so. So they have favorable regulations, they have overall government support, innovative focused society, not so much the stigma, I guess. And so there's some companies that are thriving down there, trying to shift from simply growing cannabis and manufacturing products to becoming more of a research and development facility to try and find new rare cannabinoids. And so there's a few groups out there trying to do that, ultimately just trying to bring the plant to the masses.
We're in dialogue right now with a crew talking about, what would it take to essentially manage hunting those rare cannabinoids, right? Going out and actually going to these different localities and really doing a measure. And it's kind of funny because, again, if you think about the nature of cannabis and strains and opportunity, there are so many, it's so easy to assume that, okay, well then CBG and CBD and yeah, what about all the undiscovered ones? What about that weird plant that grows on the one side of that mountain that's got that one that you can't find somewhere else, right? And what would it take to go discover those?
A lot of people are jumping into Jamaica. There's a lot of culture that comes with Jamaica. I'm not a fan really of Jamaica. I think it's super played out. And I think that the people of Jamaica are tired of white people in suits coming down and taking advantage Jamaicans. I don't necessarily think that Jamaica is the end all be all. I think that there's opportunities there for culture and tourism, but it's a third world country, as is pretty much all of the Caribbean. I've been to the Caribbean islands, and they are all they have is tourism. That's it. The people there are not wealthy at all. And so I think there's a little bit of misconception about the advantages of Jamaica. Whether it's Bob Marley or whatever, people kind of have this idea that that's what Jamaica is, whereas there's other opportunities to do business. But before we get into that, we'll kind of just do this article a kind deed and go through it and talk about unique Jamaican ganja experience. So there are companies down there building state-of-the-art cultivations on 20 acres of prime agricultural property that was once owned by the government for sugarcane. So a lot of these governments, whether it's U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, you name it, they're all kind of going on hemp pilot projects as well as medical marijuana projects to try and bring in additional tourism. So Jamaica has other advantages as cannabis producers kind of flock to the region. They have a low-cost, high-skilled agricultural labor force. It's an ideal day-night light cycle. They have fertile soil for cannabis cultivation, unique strains, multi-generational cannabis farming experience, and comprehensive research on the efficiency of cannabis for medical purposes. So obviously they have some experience doing it, but everyone knows that the Caribbean is kind of a cluster right now. There's a lot of hurricanes, a lot of issues, transportation, international fees. Hawaii is a perfect example of how expensive it can be on an island, and that's still within the U.S. Then you're dealing with outside of the U.S., and that just adds more complications to it. So there are people that like going to Jamaica. I'm not a fan. I think Puerto Rico is probably the best place in the world for cannabis companies, but it's still, I still hear a lot of people talking about Jamaica.
Yeah, it comes down to logistics for me, right? And this is where, it's a whole system. You need more, that you occasionally have a class 4 or God forbid a class 5 hurricane come through, that you have issues with power and, the labor and things like that. Again, it's a whole system. And this is where, I look at some of these breadbasket areas, right? The nature of like the equivalent of like where you grow corn. This is what I think is going to happen internationally is there's going to be a few places where you're like, that's where the bulk weed comes from. I don't know the Caribbean and that whole thing of, again, there's some neat business opportunities in terms of small and medium biz, but being the world producer for the bulk, no.
You're going to have a lot of issues working in the Caribbean. One of them is Trump's tariffs. So you have political trade wars going on. That's going to affect the industry if you're dealing with, China, for example. So no matter where you're operating from, you're going to have an issue. And so there's an article from last year from MJ Business Daily about tariffs affecting the cannabis industry, from cultivation operators, from greenhouse equipment, lighting equipment, packaging, any steel or aluminum for extraction equipment. All of that stuff is going to be more expensive now, especially with shipping, to try and get that into the U.S. because of these trade tariffs. And so having tax advantages is going to be huge. So Puerto Rico is in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico is the only place in the world you can go as an American or American business and not be forced to pay U.S. income tax. And that's because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. They don't have congressional representation. And so you remember from school, you can't have taxation without representation, which makes Puerto Rico the only place in the world you can go and not pay U.S. taxes. They do, however, have a 4% corporate tax cap. But if you go there, have an entity with your business, you can have 100% tax exemptions, 50% tax credits, 4% corporate tax cap. All that stuff is a phenomenal opportunity to be in Puerto Rico if your main market is the U.S., even North America, with free export.
Mm-hmm. Teach me for a second. So is it as simple as, do I just, put my home office there, maybe put my call center there? Is it that easy?
It's fairly easy. There's a lot of people who just know how to go online and get a business license. So you do need to go and get your own business license down there. You can utilize an attorney if you need, but it is fairly simple. You go down to Puerto Rico, get your business license, And then whatever your business is, you made a good point about a bilingual call center. Great opportunity. Research and development for terpenes, phenomenal. Land, looking at specific land, terroir, or maybe you want a business center, whatever it is. If you have an entity there, yes, it's that simple. The best advantages, or the ability to take advantage of all of the opportunities, is to live there, but you don't have to. You can just have an entity in Puerto Rico, operate anywhere, have your headquarters in Canada, file an IPO, whatever. But if your market is in the US, you need to be in Puerto Rico. Otherwise, I think 98% of all CBD companies will fail for US marketplace if you do not have an entity in Puerto Rico long term.
Well, and then to be clear, that's because of essentially the pricing advantage you're able to create by operating out of Puerto Rico, correct?
Absolutely. 4% versus 20. That's just federal, right? Then you have to pay your state taxes in California. So by switching your CBD operations from California to Puerto Rico, you're going to save minimum 16% by doing that. And that's just federal, right? You throw your state taxes on top of that, which is why it's so critical to improve your margins. Most people don't even have a 16% margin, and by moving to Puerto Rico, it automatically gives that to you. So I would look at having an entity down there, knowing how unstable it is. People of Puerto Rico are trying to fight for their rights, more freedoms and availabilities. It's one of the highest taxes in all of North America. 39% is what they are being taxed on, but they're offering businesses 4% that kind of help regenerate the economy after the hurricanes. So it's definitely something you should be looking into.
So I guess really, if I need to, hire a corporate officer specifically to deploy into Puerto Rico.
Absolutely. Yeah, you could definitely hire somebody, have them down there and operate. If all of your sales are generated through Puerto Rico, then your entire corporate structure would only be taxed at 4%. So that's the deal, is drive sales from Puerto Rico to the rest of the U.S. and then take advantage of that 4%. It's that simple.
Damn, that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of
that
savings
we just made right there. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it's like on a per transaction basis. If you're, again, I see what you're saying with regards to that whole, if ever, if your competitor has that, how do you compete with that? The only way is to have it yourself.
Definitely. There's a lot of advantages. You can contact us, josh@thetalkinghedge.com. So with that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Or don't. And I'm out.